Hey everyone, and welcome to part 2 of the Orbital Shipyard Design Lab, brought to you by chroniclesofthevoid.com. So it seems the most popular design from part 1 was actually thumbnail number 6. And number 7 and number 8 were right up there as well, so I'll be trying to take elements that I like from those ones and incorporate them into number 6, because number 6 did have some compositional weaknesses. It was kind of off balanced and stuff like that. But overall, this is going to definitely be based on number 6. So you can see here I'm kind of trying to establish my background first by doing that planet in the top and then having my sun on the bottom side. And I just have to say, I think environments can be very intimidating. At least they are for me. I don't know how you guys feel, but I always get intimidated when I know I have to do an environment. Mainly because, it's not just something simple like a mech or a person or something where you can just focus on that. But for an environment, you have to focus on the whole canvas. So it can be, intimidating when you're seeing that blank canvas to actually get underway knowing you're going to have to fill the whole thing, out with everything. But all I can say is just start it, and, even though it'll look bad at first, those first strokes while you're just trying to figure things out, just slowly build up. So it kind of looks very simple right now, but even just getting to this stage, it's very helpful. It makes you feel slightly more confident to just keep going on. So as long as you start out, you should be fine. So anyway, before I started this, I actually looked at references from like NASA pictures to try to get my mindset in that orbital state of mind, which is always helpful before you get started on a piece, to look at, various references that might help out. So I looked at those references from NASA and I tried to, pick up what I could. Obviously, one of the things I noticed was how the planet kind of has that very strong blue glow around the outside edge. Mainly, I guess would be the sun, which is kind of bouncing off the atmosphere. And it just creates this really like light blue glow, which is very pretty. So anytime you can find an excuse to do something pretty in your art, it's always good to, lead off with that and abuse it the best you can. But the other thing that I was noticing was that the planet kind of has a very, very basic blue feel. You don't really notice the land masses, so I wasn't worried too much about like drawing details on the planet itself. And the main thing you notice is clouds. So you have like these round, shapes of clouds and everything, and these high atmosphere, thick clouds, and they cast shadows onto the planet itself. So I was trying to capture some of that with my just quick speed painting of the planet. Obviously, I don't want to waste too much time on the planet surface. I'm not going to go in there and render it out. I'm just going to be working at resolution and, kind of blocking it out. In fact, throughout this whole piece, I never actually zoom in. I'm just working at resolution so I can figure out the proper kind of composition and make sure I keep my eyes on the whole overall picture and don't waste too much time. Especially because I knew I was making a video, so I didn't want to be zooming in and out and really disorienting everyone and stuff like that. So you can see I'm just kind of trying to get more details in the clouds, because I know I'm probably not going to go back there, so I just wanted to get it looking right at first. And I flipped the canvas over, which you'll be seeing a lot. And I noticed that the sun kind of felt like it was off in terms of where I placed the highlight on the planet. So since I thought for a moment, okay, which would be easier? Should I redo the highlight on the planet of the sunlight reflecting, or should I just move the sun itself? So I decided to move the sun itself, and you can see I'm just kind of trying to mask it back in and blend it back in is the better word, by using a digital airbrush, which is one of the tools I've been using for a lot of this background stuff. Basically, it's just a soft edge, brush that just kind of blocks out base colors and tones with a really soft edge. As it sounds, a digital airbrush, because the main brushes that I use have hard edges, so they don't work that great for these kind of loose backgrounds and kind of skies and things like that, where you really need those soft transitions of light and stuff like that. So my background is pretty much done, and I'm moving on to the foreground elements here. And you can see that I'm kind of trying to get some compositional stuff in mind. Obviously, since my background has this very kind of Um, I don't know if it's a slightly angled feel with the way the planet is placed and everything. It just kind of has like a feeling of lines that are going from like the left to the right and slightly upward. So I tried to place my shipyard to be perpendicular to that, just to kind of break up those lines and make the composition more pleasant on the eyes. But anyway, for the shipyard itself, I actually went with something that's more closer to, I think, number 8, but also with some slight elements from number 7 in terms of the thumbnails. But I also want to make note that I'm doing the shipyard on a separate layer than the background, and these midground ships are also on a separate layer. And I don't normally work on multiple layers like that, but I figured it kind of makes sense when you're doing something sci-fi to kind of take advantage of different layers and kind of the things you can do with different layers and stuff like that. I don't know. Anytime I'm doing like a sci-fi environment, I tend to use these more digital effects and stuff like that. And it kind of works. It makes sense thematically. Obviously, if I was going to do something like a Thomas Kincaid style New England cottage, I'd probably just do everything on one layer and try to make it feel more traditional, because it captures that sense. It captures what you're drawing a lot better if you're doing things like that. But anyway, you can see I'm just kind of filling out these ships, trying to have fun with them, make them look like spaceships however I can. I'm also using them to kind of fill out the composition. So I'm trying to use them. I'm looking at them and trying to think about how I could use the different shapes to draw your eye around the page. So I'm kind of trying to draw the eye to the right side of the page since I have so much going on the left side. So I have a lot of long ones that are just kind of pointed off in that direction and stuff like that. But the other thing about the ships is I'm trying to make them look slightly practical, and they kind of remind you of actual kind of naval ships. You can see the one in the background kind of looks like a cargo tanker or whatever, and that kind of stuff kind of sets in your mind the idea that this is like a shipyard because you're used to, naval shipyards, and you've never seen an orbital shipyard. But it kind of makes this feel right off the bat when you look at it like, oh, this is a shipyard. It's, ships and stuff. And you automatically, your brain knows what those objects are supposed to be. Those simple, really basic objects, but they're ships just because of the shape of them and stuff like that. But anyway, back to the shipyard itself. You can see I'm just kind of filling out little details and stuff like that. And I'm trying to make it feel very modular and very kind of pieced together, because obviously when you have something in space, it's probably pieced together once it's out there. And maybe this shipyard started out as just one of these sections, but then they built a twin section over on the side, maybe because they needed more space and more, traffic and whatnot was coming through, so they just needed to expand. So it has this feeling that you can always expand anytime you're doing something in space. So I wanted to capture that. Kind of has that space station feel to it. And anyway, I also put in these little kind of small ships kind of doing work out here just to kind of bring everything to life. And you saw that in the thumbnail for number 6 as well. It's an important element. You don't want things to feel lifeless and dead, unless, of course, you were going for an abandoned shipyard or something like that. But no, I want this to feel like it has some life, so I'm kind of making objects that feel like they're busy, they're doing stuff, they're off, doing little elements and things like that. Maybe they're helping repair stuff and, just doing interesting stuff. You can fill in your own story, and anytime you look at a piece and you feel like there's a story going on, that's always good, where you can like follow one person's journey through their day and stuff like that. But you can see here I flipped the canvas once again, and the nice thing about doing something in space like this is that I can actually flip the canvas any which way I want. I can look at it from any angle, and it should, as long as the composition is working, it should look right from any angle. I should be able to turn it in and mark it as a finished piece no matter which direction I'm looking at it from, if the composition is working properly. So anyway, I flipped it over and I noticed that the ship on the bottom was kind of a bit too in line with the one that was on the other side. So I redrew that to make it kind of blockier and not quite as similar and not take you right off the page. And now I'm also going in and giving it some details. So I wanted it to have a very kind of reflective metal feel to it. Obviously, most of this stuff's going to be metal, but I wanted this one to be kind of perfectly lined up with the sunlight, so it's really reflecting the surface of that. I'm sorry, not the surface. It's really reflecting just the sun itself. So similar to how you would do something like water, you just kind of mirror the colors that you're seeing in the sky on the element itself, like a mirror. So you can see I just kind of color picked elements from around the sun area, and I just kind of brought those colors in onto that ship right there, and that gave it a very reflective feel. I tried to bring in a little bit of the reflection from the shipyard itself as well, just to kind of, I don't know, break it up and not make it look too bland. But you can see I'm just kind of drawing little elements on the ships, and since this ship is so far away, all the ships are supposed to be kind of mid-ground and not really capture your attention too much. So I'm trying to be careful not to put in any high contrast stuff or any detail-y stuff that would draw your eye. Obviously, once again, if you watch the video I did on creating distance in art, I kind of went over that contrast is the most important thing in creating distance. The lower contrast something is, the less your eye will be drawn to it, so it kind of lets it sit there in the background, and not really gather too much attention, which is what you want it to do. So anyway, you can see I was taking advantage of things being on separate layers by just kind of locking the transparency of that layer and then going over it with a light brush like a glow brush or a digital airbrush to kind of give things soft gradients here and there to make this one that's right in front of the sun really get pushed into the background and make it look like it's, has that sun bleeding around it and making it harder to look at and, less focused. So there's a lot of little minor things like that I'm doing to try to adjust the eye and make things look like they're farther away or closer to you. And basically, while still trying to give them detail and story, because I don't want them to just be simple blocks. I want them to have something, so I just have to be very subtle with it and not have much contrast going on. But here we go, back on the shipyard side of things, I can actually do some contrast because this is the main focal point. So you can see here I'm kind of testing out what colors I can use on the shipyard itself, which is kind of intimidating as well because I liked how the composition looked with just them being, black silhouettes. I'm like, oh, the composition looks nice like this. So I'm being careful not to mess it up too bad, which is always difficult when you have to add details to something, but you don't want to mess up the composition that you established. But anyway, I'm trying to experiment with it a little bit, and I'm drawing just details here and there, making it look like things have actual forms to them. But you can see I'm also taking a break from that just to add some slight compositional stuff. Actually, I'm working on the values right here, if I remember correctly. I guess that's a bit obvious because you see me checking the values by making everything grayscale. And I noticed that the ship up there in the top right was blending into the planet a bit too much, so I wanted to try to adjust its values just slightly, just to make sure it wasn't mixing in value-wise with the planet stuff. It really separated itself. So anyway, just taking a slight breather here, catching my breath. But you can see I'm doing these trails coming off the smaller ships, and that brings them to life because obviously the big ships are just sitting there in around the shipyard in orbit. But I wanted these little tiny ships to feel like they're moving, so you just draw some a basic little wisp of light coming out the back, and suddenly it brings them to life. You can also use it as a compositional thing. You can trail them in different directions, the light back. You can trail the light back in different directions to help you draw the eye around the composition and stuff like that. So any line you do, any object you place, you should always be thinking about how it affects your composition, how it's going to affect the viewer when they look at this piece. So you can see here I'm kind of trying to draw in details on the back part of the shipyard here. I guess I can call it module number 2. This module number 2 is getting its details right here, but they're trying to be subtle because I don't want them to take away too much from the front part, which should be the main focal point. But you can see here I'm experimenting with adding lights to things, because I feel like that's pretty important, especially out in space. You want to have this feeling of scale. And the best way to get a strong feeling of scale is to kind of add these little white dots here and there. You can see how they work on the ship in the bottom right. Just like these little dots of color, and suddenly they feel like little cities of light, little objects. Maybe they're windows where the light's just bleeding through. But the scale at which you do those, suddenly this ship just feels massive and the shipyard just feels huge. But because before you add those little lights and things, the shipyard might feel kind of tiny. There's nothing to really establish that it's a giant shipyard out in space. It could just be a little satellite, blocky little satellite. Maybe it's the size of a bus or something. And it could still feel like that, and it just has little tiny LEDs on it. But hopefully, once I establish the front one with some of those lights as well, it'll feel like it's a giant object, which is the whole goal in what I'm doing. So here you can see I'm kind of doing some of the detailing on the front, and I wasn't having a good time with the detailing on the front, just because I was like, oh no, here I'm ruining my silhouettes, I'm ruining my value composition that I had going. So I tried to make them as simple as I could, just kind of making some lights, highlights obviously facing the direction of the sun, and then the other side has more shadows and stuff like that. Once again, just showing form is all I'm trying to do, is turn a form with these colors I'm placing. God, the longer this goes on, the worse my speaking gets. Eventually, I'll just be muttering and barely making coherent syllables. But here you can see I actually switched over to Photoshop, and that was just so I could talk a little bit about Photoshop and what its strong points are. And I feel like its main strong point is its use of like textured brushes. So you can see I'm just going absolutely bonkers with like doing these crazy shaped brushes, and really sci-fi brushes here and there, random shapes, random brushes, random things, and I completely go overboard with it, and that's okay because I'm just gonna go back and paint back over things. But I just wanted to establish all this texture, and make that front what was I calling? Oh yeah, module number 1 here in front. Just kind of make it more dense as far as details and texture go, so that way it will draw more attention. And once again, just kind of establishing different ways to add more texture density. I kind of just cut a piece of this photograph. Once again, my speech is just slowly devolving. But I cut this photograph up, and I'm just going to use it to place it around different chunks and pieces to try to bring more density into the shipyard itself. So I was like, oh, what can I do with this one? I'll just place it out here. This is kind of the more bold choice I made. I placed this piece out here to kind of represent that it's like a solar panel. Maybe it's capturing energy for the space station. But it's just kind of this like solar panel hovering on the outside. But that's about it for Photoshop. That was all I did. I didn't do any brushwork. I didn't do anything interesting. I just kind of made a bunch of blocky shapes and tried to add a lot of texture density. But now I'm back in Painter, and I'm painting things back out and kind of establishing my main forms once again with my brushes, instead of just making a mess of things, which is about all I'm good at doing in Photoshop. You can probably do stuff a lot better than I can in Photoshop. And I used to be able to paint okay in Photoshop, but now it just feels so foreign because I don't do it enough that it's just really awkward. But here you can see I'm kind of trying to establish my details once again, and I'm trying to make things make sense because I made them kind of obviously very messy. But here you can see I'm kind of working in, and I'm going to start working in my lights again, which is once again where I feel like I'm really establishing the scale of this thing, and it works a lot better on this module number 1, because I'm just going to draw these little white specks of light everywhere, and that's going to help me just sell the scale immensely. Suddenly this thing looks giant. At least in my brain it does. I don't know if you have the same feeling when you look at it, but as soon as I added all those little dots of light, It just suddenly this thing became, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. Suddenly it's just like a giant skyscraper in space instead of just being a little object. So you can see here I'm adding glow to the lights as well. Added some blue glow to the lights on module number 1, and then I added some orange glow to the lights that were coming off the ships that were flying around. And I think that's about it for this piece. I'm pretty much done. I flip it around a few times. I don't even know which way I'm going to finally place it, but here's where I'm leaving it. And I think that's about it. I'm sorry my commentary couldn't have been more concise and, practical at times. But that's just how it goes, and I hope you enjoyed watching this, and I'll be back shortly with more videos.